On a ridge where Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia meet, there used to be a road. For most of the 20th century, cars climbed over Cumberland Mountain here through a narrow notch called Cumberland Gap on a stretch that became known as Massacre Mountain. Then, in 1996, a tunnel opened beneath it. You might assume the old road was simply closed and left to rot. It wasn't. It was torn out of the mountain on purpose. The tunnel explains where the traffic went. It does not explain why the road itself had to disappear.
Hike into Cumberland Gap today, and you won't find the old highway. Not damaged, not gated off. Gone. Where 2 lanes of asphalt once carried cars over the mountain, there's now a dirt trail. That's strange, because obsolete highways are often bypassed or simply left behind. Cumberland Gap was different. Here, crews didn't just close the old road, they deliberately removed it and reshaped the ground it had occupied. Which raises the real question: why would anyone go to that much trouble to erase an already closed highway?
To answer that, you have to understand what this gap actually is. Cumberland Mountain forms a nearly continuous barrier through this part of the Appalachians. Cumberland Gap is a deep natural notch in that ridge, shaped in part by the erosive action of Yellow Creek. Long before pavement, native peoples used the gap for hunting, trade, and settlement. In 1775, Daniel Boone helped blaze a route through that same notch, and it became known as the Wilderness Road. Over the decades that followed, as many as roughly 300,000 settlers are estimated to have walked or ridden through this exact gap into Kentucky. More than a century later, road builders returned to the same gap corridor travelers had relied on for generations, although the automobile road did not always follow the exact historic alignment. The gap that had carried pioneers on foot was about to carry cars. In 1908, the Federal Bureau of Public Roads built what it called an object lesson road, roughly 2.5 miles of crushed and rolled limestone across the gap. It was a demonstration project designed to show what modern road building techniques could achieve. A fuller automobile highway later carried traffic through the gap, and the route eventually became part of U.S. Route 25E. For a while, that solved the problem it was built for. Then traffic changed, and the road didn't. The problem was that the old crossing remained a narrow, winding 2-lane mountain road, while automobile and commercial traffic kept growing. By the time the tunnel project moved forward, traffic had outgrown what the route had been designed to handle. The road that once made automobile travel through the gap possible had become one of its greatest hazards. Over the decades, the crossing earned a grim nickname: Massacre Mountain. It wasn't hyperbole. Historical accounts describe roughly 3 to 5 deaths a year on this stretch. A road doesn't own a nickname like that from one bad accident. It owns one by becoming a fact of life.
The obvious question is why normal surface improvements weren't enough. Dangerous roads can be widened, straightened, or rebuilt. But here, the problem was more complicated. This particular stretch of highway ran through Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, created because of the gap's national historical significance. Congress established the park in 1940. Part of its long-term ambition was to remove the highway and restore Cumberland Gap and the Wilderness Road to their appearance from 1780 to 1810. That created a conflict. Major surface improvements could make the crossing safer, but widening or substantially reshaping the route worked against the park's goal of restoring the historic gap. Leaving the old surface corridor largely in place left the safety problem unresolved. The eventual answer was to stop treating the highway and the historic ground as competitors.
What if the highway didn't have to cross the historic ground at all? What if it went underneath it instead?
In 1973, federal legislation authorized relocating US 25E through Cumberland Mountain using tunnels instead of the surface road. The project served two purposes at once. Moving Route 25E through the mountain would provide the needed traffic capacity while allowing the historic gap above it to be restored and preserved. Two problems, one structure. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, the mountain had other plans.
When engineers drilled a pilot bore to study exactly what they'd be digging through, they didn't find solid rock quietly waiting to be excavated. They found water. Springs inside the mountain were releasing something like 450 gallons a minute, constant, regardless of drought or rain on the surface above. They found underground cavities as well, hollow spaces in the rock, some large enough that engineers had to treat them as structural problems in their own right, not just soft ground to drill through. At one point, drilling crews encounter a body of water roughly 30 feet deep inside the mountain.
Cumberland Mountain wasn't simply solid rock. It was wet and cavernous, with continuous groundwater and large underground voids. The tunnels had to be designed around that reality. Each bore was lined with a waterproof membrane and concrete, while groundwater was drained away from the roadway. The system still manages that water today. On October 18th, 1996, the Cumberland Gap Tunnel finally opened. Two bores, each roughly 4,600 feet long, moved traffic beneath the gap instead of over the dangerous surface crossing. Traffic that had climbed over this ridge for nearly a century now passed underneath it instead, almost overnight. It looked as if the story was finally over.
It wasn't. Moving the cars underground only solved half the problem. Up on the surface, the old two-lane mountain road still physically existed. Pavement, guardrails, painted lines, cutting straight through the middle of a national historical park that had been waiting since 1940 to look like itself again. The now empty old highway still occupied the historic gap corridor the park was trying to restore. So the National Park Service went to work on the other half. Crews moved in and began tearing out the asphalt that had covered the saddle of the gap for the better part of a century. This wasn't a simple closure. They removed the pavement and base material at a cost of roughly $5 million until nothing recognizable as a highway remained. It was slow, deliberate work, closer to archaeology in reverse than ordinary road maintenance. Then came the harder part, reshaping the gap toward its documented 1780 to 1810 contours. Slopes that had been cut away to build the roadbed were rebuilt. Drainage patterns the highway had altered were reset. Workers used historical maps, photographs, surveys, and surviving traces of the original route to reconstruct the historic topography as closely as the evidence allowed. For material to rebuild that ground, they didn't have to look far. A large amount of fill retained during tunnel construction was reused during the restoration to help rebuild the historic contours of the gap. By 2002, the transformation was finished. The old highway surface, guardrails, and painted lanes were gone. What remained at the gap was a reconstructed historic landscape and a pedestrian route rather than an automobile crossing. Today, you can cross the historic gap on foot along the Wilderness Road Trail. The trail follows the historic corridor as closely as practical and incorporates surviving sections of the original Wilderness Road alignment where possible. At the saddle, the physical US 25E highway is gone. The asphalt, guardrails, and painted lanes that once defined the automobile crossing have disappeared, while the gap has been reshaped around a much older transportation landscape.
It's easy to look at that and call it a simple happy ending. Nature reclaimed, history restored, safety achieved underground. Everybody wins. But that framing skips something the entire project was quietly built around. Because that 20th century highway wasn't nothing. For decades, it carried generations of automobile and commercial traffic through Cumberland Gap. By the time it disappeared, the highway had become part of 20th century history in its own right. That created one final complication. The highway being removed was no longer just modern infrastructure. It had become a historical layer of the gap itself.
What happened at Cumberland Gap went beyond replacing a dangerous road with a safer tunnel. The old highway was deliberately removed, and the surface of the gap was reconstructed so that its earlier historic landscape could become legible again. The tunnel made that possible, but the most consequential change happened above it, when the 20th century road itself disappeared. Restoring the past doesn't mean preserving every layer of it. Sometimes it means choosing which past gets to remain visible.
Yeah.